So, hello, today I'm at St Mary and St Leonard Church in Broomfield in Essex, and I'd like to talk to you about the history of the church and the village itself. So Broomfield is a village in Essex, in the suburb of Chelmsford City. It's 2.5 miles from Chelmsford Centre and it's 1.8 miles from Little Waltham village. Broomfield is surrounded by farmland and urban development. Its elevation is 40 metres or 131 feet in old money. Today's population is around 6,750. It's fairly quiet today because we're in the last sort of part of 2022. We've got a rail strike in London and we're still in the Christmas holidays. Now, Broomfield's history is rich and varied. In 1888, a princely burial from the 7th century was discovered here in a gravel pit. The Saxon grave contained parts of a sword, a shield and a spear, with gold decoration, and there were 2 blue glass bowls and an iron cauldron. They were all encased in a dome-shaped mound, possibly Saxon royalty, but definitely someone of importance. Now, Broomfield gets its name from the Old English broom, which is a gorse shrub which sheep graze on. During the Saxon time of 1066, the manor here was divided into 3 parcels of land and held by Sololf, Segar, Border, Picot and Bodrick. Now, by the Norman occupation of 1086, the manor's lands were divided up between Geoffrey de Mandeville, the Norman noble, and Bishop Odo of Bayeux, William the Conqueror's half-brother. Now, Geoffrey Mandeville was the tenant-in-chief here, with his brother Walter acting as Lord of the Manor. Now, the settlement was small but busy. There were 9 villagers, 6 plough teams and 4 slaves. This was a sign of great wealth. And I also read that there was a water mill, pigs and sheep. And if we look in the distance, we can still see today where the old manor would have been, and correlation to the church. Now, the manor and parcels of land became divided between Patching Hall, which is a mile from the church, and Broomfield Hall, which I've just shown you. Now, Patching Hall was so ancient that it was said to have existed 500 years, before even the Normans landed here. Oh, it seems I got an audience. Oi. Hello? Oh, oh. And it was said to be the place of the people of Pysai. And it's here where the burial mound lay. Now the Mandeville family would reside here in Broomfield into the 15th century. Now Patching Hall itself would pass on to the Bourchier family in the 1300s. Robert Bourchier of 1340 would be Lord Chancellor to Edward III. He fought at the Battle of Crécy in France and died of the plague 3 years later in 1349. Now by 1539 Henry Bourchier, Earl of Essex, owned Patching Hall until he fell off his horse and broke his neck. He would be the last male Bourchier to own the old hall. Now his child Anne would marry William Lord Parr, and in 1543 Henry VIII would marry his sixth wife Catherine Parr. This was the sister of William Parr, and it would be King Henry that would make William Earl of Essex. Now I read that a Dr. Staples, his wife and children were the last to live in Patching Hall until 1961. It was then sold on to a developer, a Mr. Allan, and the hall was levelled and the developments we see there today were built. For if you go to Nala Gardens, it's Allan spelt backwards. Now Broomfield has 5 parish greens, and we're going to start with Angel Green, which we're looking at right now. Now before 1700 it was called Camomile Green. And if we pan around we'll look at the village pub, the Angel. Now today's Angel pub was known as Brownie's in 1570. It was originally a hall house dating to the 15th century with north and south wings. It's something you don't see every day. Christmas tree in the phone box. Now in 1707 Thomas Manwood was grandson of Thomas Manwood, and he became the landlord of the Angel. And this was the first time the property was actually called the Angel. Now in 1720, William Rolfe was landlord here, and he would leave in his last will and testament his stock of beer, the corn in the barn or growing in the ground, to his wife Jane. Now in 1731, Habakkuk Cook, employed at the Angel, ended up marrying widow Jane Rolfe and would be landlord here for 35 years. Now Jane would then run this old pub on her own for the next 8 years. Now from 1848, William Spurgeon would landlord and butcher here, supplying Broomfield with cuts of meat. His headstone still mentions the Angels, most unusual. And you guessed it, his widow Dorothy took over. Now during World War I, soldiers were billeted in the field behind the Angel, still called Angel Field. Now we are at Church Green, named after Broomfield's church. If we pan around, we can see the green itself. Now if you look at the building, that's where that couple are walking. This is called the King's Arms Inn. Now this is seriously old, was first titled on deeds in 1470 when it was called Crouch House. Now in 1500 Crouch House was purchased by George Boteler, and it only became a pub from 1763. Now from 1807 it was a coach and horses, most likely a hotel, and it will stay so for the next 13 years. As you look around Broomfield, you'll find many ancient buildings from the past. I wonder how many trees will be planted for the passing of Queen Elizabeth II. This is a fine oak. Now also in Church Green is Broomfield Hall. Now this old hall dates to the 15th century and stands only 100 yards from the church, just through that tree line there. If we pan around we can see how close it is to the church. If we pan back around we can make out the mistletoe which lives off this tree. Now this ancient land and manor was one of the Saxon parcels of land which was given to Geoffrey de Mandeville of 1066. Geoffrey himself fought alongside William the Conqueror at Hastings and was rewarded with 118 manors and lordships. Now Geoffrey's brother Walter would inherit this manor and lands. Walter would become the Earl of Essex, and he was honoured by King Stephen and Empress Maud in January of 1156. Now during the preparations for a royal campaign against Wales, he would die only 8 months later. Now as you can imagine, this manor and its titles would pass from family to family, such as the de Bohun's and Sir Richard Rich, Earl of Warwick. Now we should talk briefly about the 3 other greens which Broomfield has. The third is called Parsonage Green, and before 1300 it was known as How Tai. This was where the rector of Broomfield lived. Now the fourth was called Scott's Green, named after Peter Scott, a landowner of 1341. And finally Partridge Green, named after Robert Partridge of 1319. Now Partridge Farm was used as a tuberculosis sanatorium, and it was bought by Essex County Council in 1934, and you guessed it, demolished in 1960. So now we face St Mary and St Leonard's Church. So this old church, so local legend says, was to be built nearby at the top of New Barn Lane. The villagers removing stones to the top of New Barn Lane, and every night a dragon, so legend says, would move the stones back down to the green. And here we have the stones, the second one there. Finally the villagers gave up and built it here. Now the field actually called the Dragon's Foot, well at least on the old maps. Today the footprint is said to be visible in the field. And this was also the location of the 3rd century Roman villa, complete with underfloor heating. And I guess we could do with some of that now in 2022. Now these stones are more or less sarsen stones from the last ice age, and would have been worshipped most likely by the Druids of old. Now this tale of moving stones is identical to that of the church at Beauchamp Roding, where the villagers also gave up moving their stones and built the church where the stone is today. And if we look, we can just make out the second stone. And now we start off with the Lich Gate, which is Victorian, and so I've been told this is where they used to bring the coffins along here, if you can imagine an older version, and this is where they would make sure that the body was truly dead. It's great craftsmanship. Now the sun is not cooperating with me now, but we can look at St Mary and St Leonard Church. We start with the West Tower, which is in complete scaffolding. It's 15 feet in diameter and it's one of only 6 in Essex. Oh, here you go, sun's come out. Now it's extremely rare and it's built around 1130 from the local flint from the very fields which surround the church. Now externally the walls are unmarked. On top sits a conical roof rising into an octagonal spire, which we can't see now. Now in previous centuries, if I'm not mistaken, this tower was whitewashed in lime mortar. Must have been dazzling. Now the walls are thick and very defensive. They are 3 foot 6 inches thick. Now we're looking at the Victorian porch, which measures 9 feet by 8 feet. And I've got a feeling it was probably made the same time as the Lynch Gate. The architecture looks similar. Now let us go inside. Now if you look in the right hand corner, we've got the stoop, which is 15th century, and notice the broken bowl. Most likely broken in the time of Oliver Cromwell and the English Civil War. Now the actual south doorway itself, you can see I've used Roman brick, but it's probably quite modern, probably from the Victorian period. Anyway, let's go inside. We've got some nice music playing. Okay, let's pan around so we look at the south door itself, or the entrance. So now we've made our way into the nave itself, and it measures 39 feet by 22 feet. Now the south wall along here is from the 11th century. It's an early Norman wall, and it's built by, most likely by the de Mangerville family, who were the first lords here in Broomfield. We should look at the roof. Now it's supported by 4 finely arched and moulded ribs, and I believe some of the old wall plates are still visible. So if we pan around, we're now looking at the south wall and the south roof. Now in 1856, 2 roof dormers were in this south roof, somewhere here. And in one of these fine books they've published on the history, you can make out the dormers here. Now if you look at the coat of arms, which is above the south door as you enter, now this is for King George III, who was the longest reigning King of England from 1760, and he reigned for 60 years. You can see the great detail that's put into that. So now we're looking at the font itself. Now, the first church was dedicated to St Leonard, and the church was given to the prior and canons of the Holy Trinity, London. And from this time, fine Barnex stone font was given to this church around the 12th or 13th century. Now, on each side it has 3 shallow arches, and the square bowl is supported by 4 angle shafts with moulded bases. Now notice the damage. Now, during the English Civil War, this font was thrown out and discarded, and I'm told it was actually used as a horse trough near the vicarage, or in the vicarage. Now, in 1856 it was relegated as a spare font in the corner of St Mary's. Now we're looking at one of the corners, and this would be where the lid fasteners would be to prevent the holy water from being stolen. We can see there. If we pan up, we can see a further one. Now, if you look here, you can see where the stonemasons hewn it out of the stone for his tools. Remember, this is perhaps 700-800 years old. It's quite incredible. Okay, let's move down towards the chancel. Now we're going to look at this window here. So this window is called the War Memorial window, and at the base we can see the Second World War Memorial for the 20 servicemen who made the ultimate sacrifice for our freedom. Now the War Memorial window itself shows St Michael and St George. Now, St Michael is the archangel, the first mentioned in the 3rd and 2nd centuries BC. He is the chief of the angels and responsible for Israel. It's Michael who battles Satan in Revelation of John. We'll take a closer look. Great detail. I guess this is the dragon of Satan. Now, next to St Michael we have St George. Now, St George died in 303. He was a soldier of the Roman army. And he was a Greek by birth. He was a member of the Praetorian Guard and was sentenced to death for refusing to recant his Christian faith. St George is venerated as a military saint since the Crusades. We shall take a closer look. Again, a most beautiful window, great detail. Love the way the belt's knotted up. The sword. You can see where he slayed the dragon. Now, below St Michael, St George, notice the World War II tanks and soldiers, or the tank crews. If we pan around, we've got the air crews and medium-sized bomber, and you can see the hangars in the background. Even got a ladder there, work on the engine. Now, a short distance, or just a few millimetres really, next to the window we have the list of rectors and vicars of Broomfield. So this was given by Constance Nash, who was the lady of the village. And if we go closer, it goes into great detail. Now the marble corners, I've been told, were damaged during World War II by the bomb which blew out the north windows. And believe it or not, some of this is actually replaced with wood, which has been most skillfully blended in. Now we shall move just a few feet towards the chancel. We're going to now look at this lovely window. Now the top section shows the Virgin Mary, and beneath we have St Leonard. Beautiful window. And as you can tell, I'm a bit of a fan of these old windows. So now we're looking at St Leonard, who died in 559 in France. Now he became a hermit, where it's said that he prayed for the Queen of the Franks to bear a child. And he would be rewarded and found an abbey. Now St Leonard would release prisoners. Prisoners said their chains would break, and many bringing their broken irons to St Leonard. Today he is the patron saint of prisoners. Let's have a closer look. You can see Saint, the way they've put the letter in, Leonard. You clearly see the shackles and the chain there. And some curtains. Now, if we pan around, beneath the St Leonard window, we've got the pulpit. Now, this pulpit is most unusual because it's on casters. Okay, we shall now make our way to the north aisle. Now, the north aisle measures 12 feet wide and in 1870 replaced an earlier version. Now, the architect, Frederick Chancellor, drew up the plans, noticed the new pillars in the arcade to match the 11th century church. Now, if you look, it's quite hidden in the west wall. There is a memorial to Thomas Huntley of 1613, and what it shows is his daughter and son, or sons, in the year 1613. We should talk about this. So in this year, the London's Globe Theatre actually burns down during a performance of Henry VIII, and the first English child is born in Canada, Newfoundland. And you can just make out the date 1613. And it's quite unusual in that this is in English. I come across quite a few of these that are actually in Latin. So if we pan around, we can see some various pictures, etc. on the wall. We'll start with a small one in the left-hand corner. We shall walk a little bit towards the east, and we shall look at this fine painting here. Now, this beautiful painting was given by Constance Nash in 1934 after she left Broomfield Court, and she also gave the window for St Leonard. It's hard to capture the light correctly because it's an oil, I believe. While we're here, we can pan around to get a view from the pews themselves. Okay, we shall walk a little bit further east, and we shall look at this fine memorial here. Most beautiful I guess it's made in marble. So now we shall make our way down to the chancel itself. Now the chancel measures 36 feet by 16 feet, and again the south wall, up to about halfway mark, I guess where the curtain is 11th century. Now the altar end was extended around 1430. Now the actual arch itself was probably altered around the same time as the north aisle. So if we make our way into the actual chancel, we're going to look at these three windows here in more detail. Now these are the original lancet windows of narrow proportions with widespreading reveals. Now the original 1870 windows were blown out during World War II in 1943 when the north wall windows blew in. Now we're going to look at the first window, but basically Rosemary Rutherford would become a famous stained glass artist, spending her childhood here, and her father was church rector. And it's Rosemary that would actually design and get these windows made for in this church. Now Rosemary was a nurse during World War II with the Royal Navy. In peacetime, Rosemary would set up a studio in Suffolk, designing stained glass windows. We'll look at the first window from Rosemary. Now this window is the raising of Lazarus. Jesus raises Lazarus from the dead after 4 days in the tomb at Bethany. Now 6 days before Jesus is crucified, he returns to Bethany and has supper with Lazarus. So now we've moved over to the middle window. Now this is Christ with a woman of Samaria. Now Jesus travelled to Samaria and rested at Jacob's well, where around noontime a Samaritan woman draws water. Jesus says, "Everyone who drinks this water will be thirsty again, but whoever drinks the water I give will never thirst." Let us take a closer look. Now, I believe at some point the parishioners were not happy with the windows making the chancel a bit dark, so I got a feeling this window may have been made with lighter glass. Now we've moved over to the third window, which is the west window. Now, during the evening meal, Jesus poured water into a basin and began to wash his disciples' feet. Now he's drying them with a towel that was wrapped around him. And let's have a closer look. I'd like to point out beneath lovely flowers. Look at those. Now I'm surmising that these flowers would have been made by the flower arranging group of the church. They're most beautiful, aren't they? So now we shall make our way down to the altar. Now if we look around at the base, we've got the altar communion benches and rails. And these were a gift of the congregation in 1959. Now, if we look at the chancel east window, it's not centrally fitted. We're not sure why exactly. But if you look behind the Christmas tree, you can see it's more masonry this side than the south side. Let's have a closer look. Now, behind the crucifix, we can see the reredos, which is the stone depiction of the Last Supper of Christ. And they were carved by Ray and Fuller of Chelmsford. And we shall take a closer look, because it really is something special. You can see all the ornate tracery and stonework. Now, I believe that these stonemasons, for them, it's much more than a job. It's a great amount of pride. For generations, their families would be proud. Now, I'm not going to pretend who is who, these disciples, but it matters not. They're just incredible, their craftsmanship. So if I go down a little bit lower, this one's tucked away. Could that be Judas? Not sure. And we continue to the south side. You can see it's a great amount of detail. Now, if we look next to the reredos, we can see a most ornate sedilia. Now, this sedilia was donated by the local miller and flour merchant, Frederick Neild. And again, you can see great craftsmanship from the Victorian period. This would be where the priest and his assistant would sit. Perhaps they still do to this day, I don't know. If we pan around, we can get a view of the nave and the north aisle itself. Now we're going to have a close look at the window and the chancel. So I've got no information on this, but we'll just go through it. And the middle section clearly shows Jesus. And the final panel. Guess these are saints because they've got the halos. And not forgetting the panels above, which are often overlooked, but they're quite interesting in themselves. Okay, now we've entered the North Aisle again. I'd like to talk about the picture that's in front of us. Stand corrected, this is a painting donated by Constant Nash again. It's a copy of Madonna of the Veil by Carlo Dolci. Now, Dolci was an Italian painter of Florence, and he would spend weeks painting a single foot on his paintings, and his daughter made excellent copies of his work. Carlo was known for his piety. And if you go online, you'll see many copies of Carlo's work. Madonna in the Veil. Splendid, isn't it? Now, if we look beneath the painting, we have an excellent selection of books. Now, this table is for the restoration of the spire here, and the shingles, I believe, were perished. Now, it's called Project Rutherford after the artist. And I believe they've got a series of talks which will be coming soon. I think in January and February, so it's best to search online or come into church and ask somebody direct. Within the West Tower itself, there's a fresco, and I believe it's the only one in England. It's incredibly rare, and we'll have a look in a minute. This was by Rutherford as well, Rosemary. Now, the shingles in the spire were replaced, and I believe a woodpecker has been gnawing away at them. So now they're oak with metal backing. The spire and the tower, it goes into detail. And I believe these books were written by the two geologists that are volunteers here, Ian and Ross, which are volunteers, and if you get a chance to meet them, really know this stuff and are very helpful. Now, any book that's sold goes towards the restoration. So we've got one on the actual walls there, written by Ian Mercer. We've got detailed book into the monuments. Now, like I said at the beginning, there was a Saxon burial here of a princely person, and this book goes into the details. Also in Essex, there was another burial in Prittlewell, so they may be connected. There's a further book, the architecture. And we have a shingle here. Guessing this is cedar. And I'm guessing, surmising this is the oak one. Not sure. Feels like oak. Okay, now we're going to pan around and we're looking at the Lady Chapel. Now, the Lady Chapel was built around 1870, and originally this chapel was filled with benches and seats for the families from the big houses, and the congregation nicknamed this area the drawing room. And we have a display board which goes into detail about all the events that come in here. You've got quiz night there and various talks. Here we have goods that are being sold by the church, various booklets, bookmarkers, all various things to raise funds. Now we should walk into the Lady Chapel. Now, first of all, we're going to look at this amazing organ. And if you go on YouTube, there's I can't think of the guy's name, but he's an expert in playing pianos and organs. And he did actually play this very organ. There's a carving that goes in to explain this organ was set up by Richard Clay of the Orchards. I'm not familiar with that part of Broomfield. (1926). Now if we pan over, we can see the last window. And this fine window is believed to be also by Rosemary Rutherford. This is the left panel. So you can see the three wise men. They're believed to be astronomers. Sometimes they're predicted as being kings. Gold, frankincense and myrrh, which comes from North Africa or the Arabian Peninsula. It's Mary and Joseph and baby Jesus. Now, as I understand it, these gifts were actually used by Joseph and Mary to escape Herod, and they would fund their time in Egypt until they could return safely. Okay, now we shall walk towards the West Tower. We shall look at the painting on the wall. So we're now inside the West Tower. Now there are 6 bells here. We've got a John Deere of 1580 of Hitchin Bell Foundry and a Miles Gray of 1613. Now Miles Gray was called the Prince of Bell Founders. His first bell was cast 13 years earlier, and Miles Gray cast this bell, in Colchester. If we look upwards, we can see the bell ropes and an amazing staircase. Now, both his son and grandson were called Miles Gray. Now, Miles Gray I would die in 1649, 1 year after the Civil War in Colchester burnt down his bell foundry. Now, today's bells were cast by John Warner and Sons of 1874. The family business also cast beer pumps, water pumps, fire engines and taps. Their foundry was in Cripplegate, London. They also cast 12 bells for Chelmsford Cathedral. So if we pan around, we can look at Rosemary Rutherford's fresco, is it? Now, I believe the West Tower is going to be converted into a place for private prayer. And you can just make out the artist's signature or name in 1941, right in the middle of World War II. So, okay, let's leave this lovely old church and have a look outside. Don't forget my cap. And the weather's still fair and kind. That's good. So one of the things you'll notice quite quickly is the amount of brick which is in the walls here. And you'll see that these are from the Roman villa, which was built not long or far from here. We can have a look up at the tower, the immense scaffolding. Now just by the south porch, and you might not know this, but this is a pudding stone. It's quite significant. Now why would the masons incorporate a pudding stone into the wall itself? It's believed possibly that this was from an ancient altar. Perhaps from the pagan druids, and it's been incorporated. One of the early bishops instructed churches to incorporate ancient pagan stonework into the walls, and it be blessed by the priest or the bishop at the time. Now, as I understand it, this was dropped by the last ice age around 11,700 years ago, and you can see where the stone has been infused into the, whatever it is, sand, silica sand. Again, if we look, we can see the Roman brick, which is used in huge amounts. Now we've joined on to the ancient chancel itself, and we're looking at one of the doorways. So this is most likely the old priest doorway. It's been renovated, looks like the Victorian period. Now if we look around, we can see where the church was extended. I think off the top of my head it's about 1340, as you can see there. And now we shall make our way around. So as you pass through here, you'll come across many yew trees, which probably about date between 300 years. Gives you an idea of the scale of this church. Now this is the new hall, and we'll talk about this in a bit. You can see where it's been joined. Now I'd like to talk about this redwood here. Just before I do, I just come across this most interesting place for a headstone right by the doorway here. So, we pan around here. This magnificent redwood. Now these are not so common in churchyards or cemeteries. Now the wind is picking up. There's a pretty serious storm that's been going on in America, and perhaps it will come over here, hopefully not. So we shall pass by the new hall itself. Got memorial garden here. So now we are looking at the new church hall, built in 1997 or thereabouts. Now this addition brought St Mary St Leonard's right up to date. It's got a kitchen and toilets and a hall and a committee room. It's now known as St Leonard's Hall. Now directly in front of us we can see a new giant redwood, and perhaps one day this will grow as tall as the old tower over there to its right. And here we can see the Victorian North Chapel and the magnificent West Tower. And I mean, I've got to say, the scaffolding is something else, isn't it? It's a work of art in its own right. These guys are skilled. Even the company's fairly old, 1878. So it would be nice to have a little look inside the tower while it's all scaffolded up. Maybe they'll let me, I don't know. Perhaps could incorporate it with some bell ringing. So now we're finishing off with the church nave wall, the last section here. So St Mary St Leonard is open every, I think, Tuesday, Thursday from 10:30 till 12:30. Please check online. And also this church carries out baptisms, weddings and funerals, and there's many events going on, so do drop in. Thank you very much.